Hello, I'm the Angry Spork, taking issue with the final chapters of Apocalypse the 12. When we left off, most of the X-Men arrived in Egypt to face their old foe and rescue their comrades, only to face his massive army of Skrull and human sycophants, and lose more of their people in the process. With his 12 complete, and the surprise addition of Nate Gray, Sorta is on the cusp of his ultimate victory. He's got a good feeling about this one. It feels far more ultimate than all those other plans that didn't work out. Firstly, Cable number 76, written by Joe Pruitt, art by Bernard Chang, John Holdridge, Brian Miller, and Hi-Fi. The cover is simple, but not bad. The title character and Cyclops marching forward, away from a pile of rubble, with text suggesting the two may be together for the last time. Scott decides now is a good time to speak with his gray-haired, time-displaced son about the birds and the bees, and things get several kinds of awkward. We begin in a park where a young woman is looking after her special needs brother. This is Stacy Kramer, whom narration notes has had some struggles in her life, including a romance with Nathan. I wasn't collecting this title regularly, but I get the impression she's not convinced he's actually from the future. Or maybe she just doesn't like thinking about it. Her ex-reporter friend Irene shows up, who seems to be more familiar with Summers, and saying she can't locate where he's disappeared to, having uncertain feelings that he'll make it back this time. Don't worry, I have another feeling there's a younger, alternate universe version of him, so you'll get a replacement boyfriend. It's like getting the latest iPhone. We go to Egypt, re-establishing how Summers and the rest of the 12 are still bubbled, and an entire page of character close-ups that look like an all-mutant reboot of the Brady Bunch. I guess Living Monolith's panel is twice as big because he's so huge, and some of them seem to be oddly relaxed given their situation. When he awakens, Cable gets some exposition from Jean, how Apocalypse has been behind their abductions, and Wolverine became Death, which he already knows given the last issue of this title. Storm mentions their spheroid prisons dampen their powers, and it's kind of weird that Bobby Drake is still in ice form in that case. Xavier asks the Ascani son if he'd heard anything about the 12 in his future time, but unfortunately information on the current era is pretty scarce. Verbal accounts passed through generations noted them as failed saviors that fought in Sorta at Armageddon, but no specific details beyond the fact that it changed everything. Most of the information that survived were cat pictures from the internet and comments demanding the return of something called the McRib. A strange vortex suddenly appears above them, apparently unrelated to Pocky, but it seems to specifically affect Nathan and Cyclops, rendering them unconscious. Scott awakens in a devastated neighborhood, eventually finding his future son in a green field, marked with graves of the honored dead that fought against Apocalypse. Cable laments his failure to stop his foe, preventing his enslavement of the planet, seemingly all but cemented by his defeat in Cable number 75. His appearance changes to his younger self, holding the body of his deceased wife Alia, cluing Psyche in as to just where they are. Her body disappears, and they stand before a monument, Cable worried that he'll eventually forget her entirely. On a 2-page spread with some unique panels, Cable has become even younger, an age after Scott and Jean, known at the time as Slim and Red, were taken back to their present, unintentionally leaving him in the future. He'd light a candle as a ritual to honor and remember them, feel close, but he's since gotten over his abandonment. He even notes the irony of not wanting to live in the past and his whole time travel mission. Despite the dire situation, Cyclops feels content just being with his son now, and says Nathan is exactly the kind of man he'd hoped he'd become. But if Wolverine asks, we didn't hug. We showed our affection by getting drunk and punching each other, like men do. A heavy, blinding snowfall occurs, which is no less natural than anything else they've experienced, but it does leave Cable on his own in a snowy tundra when it clears. He makes a trek to a cabin in the distance, finding his dad restrained by a red-headed woman. Man, this Kim Possible reboot took a really weird turn. No, this is Madeline Pryor, Cable's biological mother and clone of Jean Grey. She pulled the two into the psionic plane, and now wants some bonding time of her own. Cabin is a replication of the one that Cable spent time in as a baby before being flung to the future, and has since become a kind of neutral zone for the two of them for its tranquility. Much as she hates Cyclops, she sensed Nathan call out psionically how he'd wished to change some things in his life, like spending time with his parents, and she decided to answer. Loving her son and not being totally heartless, she offers him safety within the psionic plane, so he doesn't have to die with the others for a doomed planet. It's implied she's made this kind of offer before, but now, as before, Cable refuses and wants her to release his dad. She does, and with Nathan adding that he thought he'd failed his mission, but so long as he lives, he's not going to abandon his responsibility, because he's a Jedi Knight, like his father before him. I mean, an X-Man. Yeah, X-Man. Scott asks her to help them stop Apocalypse, but Maddie says she's not powerful enough to be of any help, apparently little more than a ghost on the psionic plane. Also, odd placement for this dialogue bubble. It's apparently Pryor's, but seems to be pointed at Cyclops. Anyway, she returns them to their bodies just in time for Apocalypse to make yet another appearance and yet another speech of his impending victory, first remaking the Earth in his image, and then extending his reach to the stars.
Prepare yourselves for the
Age of Apocalypse. Yeah, we got it the first 7 times.
You don't know I was going to say that.
I personally found this issue a lot more enjoyable than number 75. The exposition was not quite as clunky, it was a good atmosphere for Cable to reflect on the situation and his life, and some good family time with his dad. There isn't much context made for what's happened to Madeline Pryor, no editor's note explanation as to why she's stuck in a mental plane, but what little we see of her did make it seem like she genuinely cared about her son. I did find the large amount of negative space in this panel with just 3 small squares a little odd, but maybe it's supposed to represent something I'm not seeing.
The final installment is X-Men number 97, with a cover that certainly implies a happy ending for our merry mutants, right?
Never mind. It looks like Cyclops' suit is ripping apart while he's firing an optic blast at the same time his head is spontaneously combusting.
It's his own fault for ordering his Thai food extra spicy.
Scripted by Terry Kavanagh, plotted by Alan Davis, who also provides art alongside Mark Farmer and Steve Oliff, we begin with a splash page establishing Egypt, in case you forgot that's where it took place. Narration notes how lush it once was, as a cradle for modern civilization. Man worked with man here, free from the all-consuming need to hunt and gather, free to create, to love, to think, and to hate.
Being indifferent, however, would cost you about $2.75 plus tax.
And am I missing something, or wouldn't they need to hunt and gather for, food and stuff? In the present, the non-captured X-Men are still battling the cult members of the Children of the Sun and their Skrull allies. Their numbers are overwhelming, but that kind of works in their favor, since it prevents them from being fully destructive with their weapons. This was said out loud within earshot of the Skrull commander, who decides to unleash the Skrull mutants like attack dogs, targeting the traitor Fizz, but fortunately Beast backs him up. Apocalypse elaborates to Nate Gray that the tech he's using is usurped from the Celestials, and he's finally found the means to power it for his conquest, even if it took a millennia of stoking humanity's fear and hatred. Energy surges through the prison capsules of the 12, their raw energies channeled through the living monolith and into Nate, whose body Pocky intends to take in order to contain such massive power levels. Back at the battle, the commander is about to punish a young soldier for running scared, only for Fizz to give him a literally massive punch to the face.
Such a mighty wallop.
And before that, there were several narration captions reminding the reader that the Skrulls typically killed off their own mutants shortly after birth in a twisted vision of genetic purity, which made that punch all the more satisfying.
He tells the scared stray Zakan that they no longer have to live as slave soldiers, only to be done away with once their usefulness expires. His friend is conveniently telepathic, and he suggests peering into Fizz's mind to see his experiences meeting the Xavier and being with the X-Men.
But don't be reading my mind between 4 and 5. That's Willie's time!
Meanwhile, Apocalypse is still being all chatterbox until the transfer is interrupted. The power is being reversed.
Turns out the draining machine is operated through a giant switch with only 2 settings, on and ruin evil plan.
Turns out Magneto's powers have been exhausted earlier than anticipated, because of his secretly waning power and need to be recharged by Fabian Cortez. This ticks off the first mutant, but hey, the strongest adapt, so he'll accelerate the process using one less power source. Abdal, the living monolith, realizes that Apocalypse destroyed the man he was just to use him as a power conduit. This gives him the strength to bust himself and the others out in a rage. Somehow. I guess because he was the conduit, his anger let him burst free, but it seems to counter the fact the orbs were suppressing their powers. He starts rampaging, and several of the mutants try holding him off, while he's still processing energy through the damaged conduit, but his mind is too far gone for any telepathic connection. Phoenix nabs the Prof, while Magneto is aided by a Polaris, who isn't fully colored in this panel, and what little color was added is incorrect.
She's not a brunette. She's she has green hair, so greenette? Lime blonde? Citrus ginger?
After saving Rogue from some falling rocks, Gambit finds himself on the business end of a blaster rifle, only to be saved by one of the Skrull mutants, all of whom have been inspired by Fizz and Zakan to fight their oppressors so the X-Men can head inside the temple and save their friends. Speaking of, several of the X-Men headed to Apocalypse are stopped by Deathbird, Caliban, and Famine, who is only now mentioned as previously known as Ahab, a mutant hunter. I'm not familiar with him, and his deal is a bit complicated, and this review's going on long enough as it is, so moving on. With time running out, Mikhail warps them and himself to a different dimension, as a small penance for his personal misdeeds. Even though Moira McTaggart's analysis concluded he couldn't do that anymore, Pocky must have somehow known otherwise. And Mikhail himself, apparently, otherwise why would he attempt it in the first place?
Maybe his initial plan was hoping the three horsemen would be too busy beating him up in a cartoon dust cloud so the others could sneak away.
After Psyche remarks that he doesn't want to have to be the one to tell Colossus his brother is lost in dimensions, again, he, Xavier, Jean, and Cable arrive at the chamber where their foe is keeping Nate. Apocalypse does something to injure Charles, and Cable is unable to reach the energy bubble the Tyrant is trapped in. Meanwhile, the others aren't making much headway against the monolith, even after Magnus uses Polaris to tap into the Earth's magnetic field. All the Giant is doing is absorbing the energy, which gives Bishop an idea. Since he absorbs energy as well, he starts drawing power from Abdal until he collapses. But the temporal energies pull him back to the timeline of his solo title. Cyclops manages to hit Apocalypse with a direct blast, but the villain just starts absorbing it, which is neat and all, but because of Cyclops' telepathic connection to his wife, this gives Phoenix an opening to bypass Pocky's defenses and telekinetically blast him from the inside. Major mistake, Apocalypse!
Hello, Major Mistake. I'm Private Indiscretion.
The attack ruptures the High Lord's armored exterior, revealing a withered old human form beneath it. He considers the flesh a mere vessel for his unending will, which he's currently in the process of replacing as he blasts Jean aside. With their enemy in so vulnerable a state, a slingshot could stop him at this point, but Summers is so drained he can't even fire an optic blast and has no time to recharge.
I've got this portable battery pack if it helps. No? Well, never mind. It's only at 17% anyway.
Probably doesn't matter. He's been building to this moment for the entire history of the planet.
Not really. He's only a couple of 1,000 years old, dude. He wasn't around when the Earth was formed millions of years prior.
Well, my mistake, billions of years prior. Scott's point, eventually, is that for all Pocky's strategy and contingencies, his aim of celestial transcendence isn't too far removed from when Jean housed the Phoenix Force, and thanks to their rapport, he has some context for that. He tells his wife he loves her, and what she means to him, then shoves Nate Gray aside, taking his place in the transference. The other X-Men arrive, horrified, as friend and enemy are awash in red light, and narration speaks of Jean and Scott's lives together. They lived a life of glory and high adventure. Together they reached beyond the stars. The last coherent image Jean receives from him, before their rapport dissolves in psychic static, is of laughter.
Clearly, he was not watching The Big Bang Theory.
Nate is both mournful and perplexed. Mournplexed? Because he and Scott are practically family on a genetic level, so he serves their foe's purpose just as well. The comic ends on a 2-page spread of the X-Men watching a new form before them, a merging of the two. Apocalypse? Psypocalypse? Scott Saba Numbers? Anyway, Xavier says that he can't sense any trace of Scott's soul.
Which I guess telepathy can detect? I suppose it's useful whenever Nightcrawler gets into an argument with an irate atheist. But more to the point, this merging just proves Scott really didn't want to tell Colossus about his brother's disappearance.
I kid, but this is actually a great image. Striking, disturbing, foreboding, and the X-Men are appropriately expressing several emotions, from sadness to despair, horror, and confusion. Events continue in the Ages of Apocalypse story, but we'll get to that another time.
That was Apocalypse the 12. It had an appropriately big scale, and you might overall forgive some of the continuity hiccups in the art and narration.
Mostly, I thought the pacing was fine. Wolverine scouring the city for Archangel was kind of a detour, but you could argue that wasn't part of the main story. Cable 75, however, was listed as part, but it was more focused as an anniversary for the title, filled with a lot of splash pages and overall kind of kinked up the flow. I would have liked to see a few panels devoted to Fizz convincing his fellow mutant Skrulls to rise up. Zakan could have projected his knocking out the commander while they all seem hesitant at first. Then a page or two later, have the reveal of them fighting back in earnest. I feel this would have helped add weight to the decision, and being done in the mind, it wouldn't have interrupted the flow of battle. Though I did notice it was weird, Fizz is the only one with those gold brackets on his forehead, and those are supposed to be an overall branding specifically for Skrull mutants. There was this habit of characters describing what's going on, or expository dialogue that just kind of feels weird given the situation, like Jean giving the alternate names of the current horsemen. It's kind of a pet peeve, but didn't feel like a big hindrance. The main threat seemed appropriately grand, the big attempt by one of the biggest bads to conquer the planet and lay waste to whomever he deemed weak.
But when all was said and done, was this plan as brilliant as it was boasted to be? Sure, Apocalypse was impressed with it, and we all know he's probably his own harshest critic.
I can overlook the ambiguous means by how this advanced technology just saps raw power from people inside the orbs, but for all the talk of how it was going to be fatal for the 12, they didn't seem all that fazed by it in the end. I guess you could say they were re-energized when the transfer was briefly reversed, but really it seems like Magneto should have been dead much sooner. And while his unadvertised depletion of power was a clever obstacle that Apocalypse didn't foresee, he still seemed to be aware of other stuff just out of convenience, like Mikhail's dimension hopping and how to play the X-Men against each other, or anticipating that they can be more resilient than others. For all his planning and scheming, you'd think he'd have accounted for a bit more. Cyclops' sacrifice was an interesting turning point, though Nate didn't seem convinced it would make much of a difference, based on their genetic connection. However, Apocalypse chose Gray for his new body because of the immense power he held. I mean, true, Summers was no pushover, but Nate was constantly being regarded as one of the strongest on the planet. And it could be argued that if Scott could get this close to Apocalypse and their foe was that weak, why not get up behind him and choke him out with a headlock, or snap his neck, or poke his eyes out or something?
This wasn't a bad story. A good threat that today would have been a 12-part series with dozens of tie-ins and claims of changing the universe forever. Just not on the hyperbolic scale DC and Marvel are known for today. And it's much better for it, even if it's working on something mentioned over a decade earlier. I'm the Angry Spork, and man have I got issues.